about that. I was trapped by the most common trap in our lives these days. Forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for joining us again. One more time, I can't wait until you're in the House Republican caucus room. I miss that place, but more than that, I miss the people that are in it, including every other week or so, all of you. Lots of things happening, I think, over the last week, lots of things to come as well. If you missed it, I thought we had a pretty well organized, less lengthy debate last night on a bill that probably not a lot of people noticed, but is pretty critical and emblematic of what is happening to the small business community in the state of Washington last night on wage liens. And you heard a bunch of House Republicans, including some very highly experienced, highly qualified woman Republican representatives, talk about just how deeply that was going to affect the small business community in Washington. And I say it's emblematic of this district, of this session, because we have seen this time and time again. And it is extremely alarming, I think, for our caucuses, where we have these people with a lifetime of small business experience and nobody's listening to them. We have a lot of other topics to cover this week and a lot of people here to speak. So I'll just turn it back to John now.
All right, next we'll go to Representative Drew McEwen.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. As we know, we've been in a state of emergency now for well over a year, and the legislature has, as of yet, failed to reassert itself into this role and has ceded everything to the governor and his ability to issue proclamations under that state of emergency. Nobody disagrees that we should have gone into a state of emergency when this pandemic started, but many of us on a bipartisan basis feel that it's time that the legislature puts itself back into its equal co-branch of government. House Bill 1557, which was introduced a week and a half ago, is a bipartisan bill that would do precisely that. The governor, of course, can still issue a state of emergency, but that can only go for 60 days. It could be extended by a concurrent resolution of the legislature if we're in session. If we're not in session, then 3 of the 4 caucus leaders would have to agree to extend that emergency, that state of emergency. I think it is vitally critical that the legislature reassert itself, get back into the tape, get back at the table here when it comes to state of emergencies, and have an active role in governing the state. I don't think the founding fathers of our state, or this nation for that matter, ever envisioned one person having complete control for an extended period of time. And I think it flies in the face of our Democrat Republic that we've allowed this to continue. So again, we have a bipartisan bill to answer to that. I think it's time that the leadership of the Democrat Party step forward and say, you know, it is right and it is proper that the legislature have a positive impact and control when we're in these states of emergency. So I am calling on the Speaker of the House and on the Senate Democrats to act, and let's move this bill forward before session is done. I think it would be a tragic ending to session to not address this issue. So it's my hope that we'll get movement forward. And again, we have members from both parties that are willing to move forward on this bill. And I'm again calling on this bill to get heard and move forward in the process. Thank you.
All right, next we'll go to Senator Braun.
Thank you, thank you, John. I'll be fairly brief, and that's because, for the most part, you know, our focus hasn't changed really in the last year. We went into the pandemic focused on how we safely get our businesses back operating, how do we get our kids back in school, and how do we make sure we have a ongoing sustainable budget. And there's been some ups and downs, but here we are in the 13th week of session, and we're fighting still to get everybody opened back up in a safe way, but also to push back on the enormous number of restrictive and costly bills to our business sector that are in front of us that will harm folks' ability to find jobs and to support their families. So we're pushing back on that. We're still working, and we've picked up folks along the way, and we're making progress, but we're still working on getting our children back into schools in person safely. And we continue to have resistance to that, even though we know harmful things are being done to these kids because they haven't had access to in-person school. And then finally, the budget. And, we're at the time of the year when the budgets start to come together. And we've seen two proposals that are frankly unsustainable. They rely heavily on federal funds. They don't spend it in one-time ways exclusively, and are going to leave an enormous bow wave in the next biennium. So we're still fighting on the same things. You only have so many options from the minority, but we're using every option we can to try to convince the majorities that some of these are absolutely the wrong path for the state of Washington. Back to you, John.
Next, we'll go to Senator Erickson.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on today. It's good to see everybody's smiling faces here on the Zoom call. A couple of items I want to talk about. First, stressing a couple of troubling trends that we're seeing both in Washington State and across the country. The first one being the price of energy. We're seeing gasoline prices go up significantly in Washington State here and across the country. Also, you will notice that Puget Sound Energy just went in for a rate increase for supplying electricity, which means other companies will be following shortly for increases in the cost of electricity under existing law. And another interesting story that could have some very long-term impacts on our economy is the massive increase in the cost of building materials here in Washington State and around the country, where you're seeing, for example, the price of a single piece of plywood for sheathing on a roof doubling in price from about $15 a sheet up to over north of $37 a sheet right now. So that's a lead up to a couple of big issues that are in front of the legislature right now, one being cap and tax, and the other one being high cost fuel standards. Both of these, if done improperly, could lead to massive increases in the cost of energy for the people of Washington State. We have a graph that was put together by nonpartisan committee staff that layers in all the different potential tax increases from that. With LCFS, or I call it high cost fuel standards because it raises the cost, could be north of 50 cents a gallon in terms of cost. Cap and trade or cap and tax could also have a major impact upon the price of energy in Washington State. And this cap and tax bill that we're seeing this year is more expansive than others in the past, which could also have a great chilling effect on manufacturers who want to come to Washington State, or manufacturers who might be thinking about leaving Washington State. And this could be a catalyst. So in a highly competitive world that we live in, having these policies go into place right now could be very damaging to the long-term economic stability of Washington State.
With that, we will go to questions, and we will start first with Sarah Gensler from McClatchy.
Thanks, John. Last night, the Senate voted on the police tactics bill. I understand not all law enforcement stakeholder groups are on the same page with that one, but the Fraternal Order of Police supports it in its current form as a sort of middle ground. I'm curious then why you think all Republicans voted against it, and if you would kind of go into that dynamic a little bit. That would be for probably Senator Braun or Senator Short.
Sure, I'd be happy to start off, and then Senator Short may have some other comments. So, that was, I don't know if you had a chance to watch the debate. It was a long and vigorous debate on a number of issues, and there are a lot of things in the bill that I think we got to agreement on, but there's a couple things that we did not agree with, and not all law enforcement agree with. So I would not call this kind of a middle ground, largely supported bill. Specifically, a lot of debate on the use of tear gas, and I thought very thoughtful arguments on when that is appropriate to prevent additional harm to either protesters or bystanders. And I think that we have, at some level, we have to trust our law enforcement folks to use that thoughtfully when it's necessary and to prevent additional harm. And so that was one of the issues that was debated at length. The other one was, the other kind of important issue was when it's appropriate to have, to pursue a suspected, let me just back up. When it's appropriate to pursue. I thought that was a thoughtful debate, and there are legitimately different points of view that rational people could come to, but we felt that was important to broaden that, give our law enforcement officials additional authority to do that when they thought on net there was a higher risk of additional harm to the public if they didn't pursue. So I think we're getting close on the bill. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and the other side was unwilling to find a path to the middle ground. So that's for that reason you saw most of our folks vote against it.
And Sarah, this is Senator Short, I'd just like to add on, the biggest issue on pursuit was the extra layers of kind of getting that advance permission, if you will, in this bill. And so that's why you saw a lot of the amendments, taking away that opportunity for that individual law enforcement officer who is in the midst of the situation, could endanger, people going forward if they aren't able to take issue, immediately. And I think the other thing, just as a general course, you're making it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs, to think of situations and the appropriate use of deterrence that they may need at a particular time. I go back to, they're making those split-second decisions, and it's, to me, you may get yourself in a situation where you're using more deadly force to contain a situation or to prevent harm, both to the person they might be pursuing or the general public. And that may be an unintended consequence, and there's concern there that you are taking legitimate tools away. And look, I'm not trying to undermine the reason that we have these bills. I think there has been healthy debate and discussion around these issues, but the bill that we saw last night, I think, really takes away needed things from law enforcement to make those in the moment decisions that they're required to make in their job.
And Sarah, I think if you look at public safety in the broadest terms, it's a variety of bills. It was time to have these discussions. And I think you're seeing some successful government being done. I think most Republicans agree that our approach is going to be that we want to preserve the tools that are necessary to keep people and law enforcement officers safe. And at the same time, we want to do everything possible to make it as unlikely as possible that they're going to be misused. And the original proposals went too far. I think a lot of people in the other caucuses agreed that they went too far. And it was the job of the minority to provide opposition that then allowed those bills to be moved to something that was more reasonable and acceptable. A lot of us don't think that they went far enough, but if the minority was unwilling to do their job, we would be left with bills that were unsafe and unworkable. So this has been a fun project for a lot of people to work on, gut-wrenching for others, and we ended up with a much better product than we would have had if we had not been fully engaged and willing to take the slings and arrows that you get with opposition.
Sarah, did you have a follow-up?
Well, I'm curious if Representative Wilcox, do you think that there's any chance you might see some votes from your caucus in favor of the bill in its current form now that it'll go back over to the House?
I don't have a prediction on that, but I would say that, again, I think this is a much broader topic than that single bill. And you've seen Republican votes in favor of some of the other bills that are just as important around this topic.
All right, next we will go to Essex Porter of Cairo TV.
Hello, good morning. Sorry to have a bit of a delay unmuting. I wonder if one or two of you would turn attention to the transportation bill. I notice in the Senate proposal, I think the gas tax increase alone would be 9.8 cents. But then, of course, there are billions and billions of needs. Is such a gas tax increase worth it for what the state needs and what people would get?
I find it interesting, Essex, that well, it's not surprising though that the Democrat Party continues to have the only answer be more taxes and more fees on the people of the state. We're roughly, I think, number 2 or number 3 in gas tax collections, but yet we rank, I believe, number 40 in the nation in terms of our infrastructure. That's a huge disconnect. we need to readdress really how DOT is operating, how it's managing projects or not managing projects. And throwing more money at the problem doesn't always solve it. And again, I just go back to that statistic that we're one of the top states for gas tax collections, but ranked near the bottom in our infrastructure quality. Something's got to change here. We've also got legislation that's been introduced in both chambers over the last couple of years that would fundamentally change how we fund our infrastructure and our maintenance in the transportation. And that's taking the sales tax from automobile sales and putting it into the transportation budget. There's a direct nexus there. We don't increase the taxes on our people, and we can, through economic growth, absorb that in the operating budget if we gradually implement it over a number of years. So there's other solutions that are out there that need to be looked at, and I challenge the other side of the aisle to take a good look at some of these other proposals instead of just asking for more and more from the people of this state.
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, the Senate Republicans offered a full operating budget that moved all the sales tax from motor vehicles to the transportation budget, would have provided $24 billion over the next 16 years. It dwarfs the current proposal offered by the Senate Democrats and involves no new taxes. And we are uniquely positioned to do this year, given the additional revenues we saw from the revenue forecast and the federal funds, along with our expected pay down of the long-term pension liability. We could make this change right now and fundamentally alter the financial foundation of our state for transportation. There just has not yet been the political willingness to do it.
Senator Braun, to follow up, but doesn't that mean taking money away from education?
No, it doesn't, Essex. Well, we've shown this. If you go study the budget that we rolled out over 2 months ago now, it shows, you know, budget education funding continuing to grow greater than the rate of inflation in population, and still funding transportation. That's what my point is. And it's not getting a lot of attention, frankly, but the point is we have an opportunity right now to do this without harming education, without harming services, and fundamentally change our future. There just isn't willingness to do it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, next we will go to Hannah Scott. Are you there, Hannah?
Oh, there we go. Hi, guys.
All right.
Sorry about that. And I had a couple of quick questions. I wanted to go back to Representative Wilcox regarding, and actually Senator Braun too, there on the police accountability bills that are still out there. The decertification bill, I believe 5051 should be coming to the House at some point soon. And you had suggested this is a part of a larger discussion. I would be curious, Representative Wilcox, where you think you or others in the House might land on that decertification bill. And then the use of force bill, I believe, just passed out. And I think Senator Braun, you were a pass without recommendation out of Ways and Means. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, for the House, I'll defer to Representative Maycomber, who's our floor leader, has had to deal with designing the debates and also has what some of you might not know, a background as a commissioned law enforcement officer. Jacqueline?
Thank you. When you talk about these packages of bills that we've been discussing, we really need to look at, do they make our communities less safe? And do they make the officers less safe on the streets? So you first mentioned the 5051, the officer oversight policy. And so there's a lot of aspects to that policy that you know, there are good parts, but there are also really difficult parts. And sometimes when we create policy in separate silos that we talked about, you almost create what you're trying to prevent. So you create an environment and a profession where people who want to serve their communities feel less desired to do it because of the liability, because of the danger, because of the inability to protect themselves and the community around them. And so when you look at these packages as a whole, we need to really move towards community policing. And I've been an advocate over this for the years. When law enforcement officers are a part of the community, when they can play basketball with the kids, when they can get to know people, you really see a better communication and a better policy. My bill 1001 that creates more diversity in law enforcement just passed the Senate last night unanimously. Having that conversation really helps. But when you talk about these policies that put the liability back on the officer, not the chain of command, not the city that hires them. And so when they have to stop, just as Senator Short mentioned, for a pursuit, who holds the liability if that vehicle continues to go down the street, whatever that infraction may be, and then there's an accident? You're putting the liability on the officer, not the department as a whole or the city who hires them. So there's a lot of aspects to this we have to really engage in. Washington State ranked 50th in the nation for law enforcement officers per capita, which means law enforcement officers are going from call to call to call, and it's reactionary policing. And so you see not only a response from the community that's not having positive interactions with law enforcement officers, but you're seeing the response from the law enforcement officers where we're really having a difficult time to hire. And a lot of the larger departments are losing officers. So now you have this created environment where you have officers working longer, harder hours without really engaging in the community. So these packages of bills really create a more dangerous situation if we aren't able to really look at the issue as a whole. And that is, we need to move towards community policing in Washington State and not reactionary policing. And so this whole package of policies we have, and as Minority Leader JT Wilcox mentioned, we're moving towards, the minority is to move this policies towards more workable solutions, but they are difficult as the way they are being brought to the House right now, and the policies that we will be looking at in 5066 and 5051. And so we're looking to bring amendments to the floor to really discuss how to make them easier for the communities and the police. So we don't create an environment where we have less officers for our families, for our communities, to response times, and the officers have a more difficult time protecting us.
Anna, did you have a follow-up?
I did. And actually, this is also for Representative Maycomber, since you're on the line. I understand that your bill, and I apologize, I don't remember the number, for mental well-being of officers died, but there was going to be a budget add hopefully for it. I think that was in there. Is that there? Can you speak to that? And if so, can you speak to the overall idea behind it?
Yes, absolutely. House Bill 1000 was fully funded in the House budget, Democrat budget. What that bill does is it really looks at the overall health of a law enforcement officer. We don't want law enforcement officers that don't have the ability to speak to someone in difficult times, to look at crisis, peer-to-peer counseling, and having that overall mental and physical health. And so a healthy law enforcement officer really responds healthy in any event. That bill was not needed to go through the process. It was fully funded in the House Democrat budget. And that's something that it's a bipartisan policy that we can all look at. When we talk about, again, reactionary policing, it's very difficult to go to call to call to call without really engaging in that, crisis moments, those critical moments that for you and me are very difficult. They go to every day over and over again. So making sure that we create a healthy environment for law enforcement officers, and some really some good connections and some healthy communication is really important for the state of Washington.
All right. Next, we will go to Jerry Cornfield of the Everett Herald.
Make sure I've unmuted myself. Good morning. Thank you very much for taking a question. I guess this is for Senator Erickson. I would just be interested. I know you're not going to be in the room for some of the chats about the end game, but what is your thought on where the Democrats are headed on the issue of carbon policy, transportation package, the so-called grand bargain? We've heard yesterday the House is not aware of all of the details. It's all in the Senate right now. I'm wondering what your perspective is, and maybe Senator Braun's as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Obviously, under one-party rule here in Olympia, they are doing some of these things without full Republican input. But I think that the problem they're running into is what I mentioned in my opening comments, which is the price of gasoline is going up, the price of commodities is increasing. You have talk at the federal level of a rather significant increase in the price of gasoline and other types of federal level carbon taxes, cap and taxes, high cost fuel standards coming in from there. And once you start layering all of these on top of each other, I think they're realizing two things. Number one, the public might not have an appetite for it. And number two, it could have a huge detrimental impact on the overall economy here in Washington State. I mean, just look at the prices of housing construction materials right now, which is an economic driver in Washington State. Right now, we're seeing a bump because people are still building, and sales tax. Obviously, if I'm paying $35 for a sheet of plywood, I'm paying more sales tax. But that could dry up as people aren't able to afford to do the projects anymore. So I think that's what they're trying to come to grips with. Can they find a place where they can land, where they have enough votes? And the other complicating factor, I think, is I think there's a pretty intense battle within their caucus, because I think many of their members want to create this social justice, environmental justice committee and give this non-elected branch spending authority over cap and tax revenues, or cap and tax dollars that come into the state. So we'll see what they're able to come up with. But the question, I think, at the end of the day is, what will the public think of these big tax increases that are getting layered upon them? So if you have cap and tax, high cost fuel standard state level, gas tax increase, combined with federal tax increases at the same time, I don't know if they can, if even the Democrats will try to push that stuff through.
Piling on a little bit in response to Doug here, I think at the national level, Democrats are beginning to realize what we've been saying all along. When you depend so much on revenues created by taxing gas, one of the basic commodities for human life in our century, it is as deeply regressive a source of revenue as you can possibly identify.
Jerry, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess also procedurally, it's probably more of an issue in the Senate at this point, but you did try as a caucus to get cap and trade sent to the Transportation Committee. That didn't work. The low carbon fuel standard bill bypassed Transportation Committee. I guess I wonder if you'll still make an attempt to drive it, if you consider it necessary to implement the budget, and if you drive it back and try to drive it back to transportation.
Yeah, let's be clear, based on the very rules put in place by the majority, both of those bills should have gone to transportation. Their argument is, well, the chair of transportation said it's okay. Well, just to be clear, at one point, the chair of transportation said it wasn't okay, and that low carbon fuel standard, or the high cost fuel standard, as we like to call it, he said it would go to transportation. So they're sending mixed messages, but more importantly, the chair of transportation is not the only person on that committee. It's a committee, and yes, he's the chair, but to say everybody else on the committee doesn't get a chance to weigh in and think through the policy, I think is frankly undemocratic, to put it plainly. So yeah, we'll continue to challenge that. We think it was the wrong decision for the bill, wrong decision for our state. Now, fundamentally, I think I'd go back to what Senator Erickson said is they're starting to realize, I believe, that within their own caucus, that these bills are enormously harmful to the most vulnerable folks in our state. They are very regressive. They hurt folks who are at the bottom of the economic spectrum. They hurt rural folks who have to travel more. They're opposite what they like to talk about, and they're finally coming to terms with, they got to decide what they really care about. Do they just want more money, or do they really want an equitable, fair tax system? And you can't have both.
I want to piggyback on.
Oh, go ahead.
The minority leader said, it's really important that when we talk about the cost of building materials, we also don't forget the cost of food, which I think that we kind of overlook until, we try to go to the grocery store and manage those weekly food costs. That's really important. And I come from a district where people are struggling. When people talk about how much bread costs and how much milk costs, and that is all in transpo, that's all delivered, and that's used through tractors and, making sure that we can cultivate. If not, that product will be, grown overseas. It'll be grown in South America. We really need to continue to make sure that we build up our local farms and we don't, increase any kind of taxation that would force them out and create more carbon in the end.
Well, and Jerry, I'd just like to follow up when we think about what we came into this session being, virtual, never done before in the history of the state of Washington, and the challenges that is presented for people to participate. Yes, they can participate in their hearings, and things like that. But there are significant pieces of our process that we've not been able to engage in. Those face-to-face conversations, the conversations in the hall, the conversations being pulled out of committee, the things we do on the floor. And so when you have rules in place that these bills should go to their appropriate committees, you're really doing a disservice to people in the state of Washington, to what I believe is shortcut the process. And it's not only the members who serve on those committees, it's also the public's, you're shortcutting the ability of the public to weigh in. And I think my frustration this session has been, taking on incredibly draconian, expensive bills at a time in the process where we have less of our process. And that's been disappointing to me. So I think for the fact that these bills didn't go to transportation when they very clearly should have, is short-circuiting the process. And that does not set it well. It does not bode well for people who are going to be living under those potential laws and paying the price.
Just really quick, sorry, I should have mentioned this in my opening comment on this also, but we can't forget also that we are supposedly living in a state of emergency in Washington state. You wouldn't have known it at the Buffalo Wild Wings on Monday night when I unfortunately watched our Gonzaga Bulldogs lose because the restaurant was packed out with people. But we are in a state of emergency. We are in a worldwide pandemic. And here we are having that conversation about massive tax increases in a very regressive fashion on working families in Washington state. To me, that seems like a rather difficult conversation to be having if you truly believe that we are in a state of emergency in Washington. And don't forget the $15 billion that just got sent to us from the $1.9 trillion federal stimulus.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And Hannah Scott sent this to me via email. She had to hop off the call, but asked that I relay it to the group. And that is, yesterday, the Democrats indicated to me the plan was to let the emergency clause on the open carry bill remain, even though it's there due to misinformation about the Washington State Patrol request. She was just wondering if both the House and the Senate could share their opinion on that.
Well, I think that they ought to publicly correct the record, for one thing. And pull the emergency clause off. That's corrosive to the process when you let misinformation like that, stand in public. We've called it out, and I think we've been charitable in our interpretation of how it got there. But if I was in their position, I think I would try to publicly make amends.
Nothing to add to what JT just said. This is to make that claim based on misinformation, then be unwilling to fully address it just isn't right. And frankly, we'll oppose the concurrence in the Senate because it's based on misstatement of facts, and there's no underlying policy driver for that. We have seen in this session the repeated misuse of the emergency clause, and not just in this session, although I think in recent years we'd gotten better at not using it unless it was truly necessary. We've gone back, appears, with the current majorities to using it whenever it's politically expedient, and that's disappointing.
With that, we will go to closing remarks from the leaders. We'll start with Representative Wilcox.
Good seeing you all. See you next week.
Yes, thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to see you, even if it's only virtual. Hopefully someday it won't be virtual. We are going to go back to work and try and finish up the last few weeks of the session in the way our constituents expect, and fight for what we believe is right, fight for a real, true democratic process, and we'll see how it ends up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you.